Quite some time ago, I remember reading a viral tweet from an American dentist that made me laugh out loud. If I recall properly, the dentist was sarcastically replying to the typical press story of 9 out of 10 dentists recommend. The dentist said something along the lines of, I've been in this profession for 20 years and nobody has ever asked me anything. And the thing is, I talk to my colleagues at the conferences and the meetings, and I have never once met a single dentist who was asked anything either. I think my automatic and almost involuntary laugh came from realizing that every industry is dealing with the same issues. It also made me realize that I tend to read news about surveys, trends, and market research in our own sector with a mixture of amused disbelief and skepticism. And I couldn't help but start wondering since when and how all this happened to me. How did I go from being a marketing believer in market research and the power of data to a sarcastic skeptic? Or maybe I'm just getting old or turning into a cynic. Who knows? It could well be a bit of everything, but let me try to explain it better. I'm David Del Pino and this is Fresconomics. Welcome to the fresh produce business, a world where uncertainty is the only constant and volatility shapes every decision. Every day, remarkable people navigate this chaos with skill and courage. Join me as we explore the hidden logic of this industry to decode what others call unpredictable. I suppose I wouldn't feel this disbelief quite so intensely without the initial and thrilling intellectual fascination I once suffered. After studying a master in marketing in 2003, I deep dived passionately into market research techniques, positioning maps, and all sorts of quantitative data analysis. I even went back to my engineering notes from the statistical classes and I kept reading widely on these subjects for years. But nothing I read or learned seemed to be applicable to my business in fresh fruit and vegetables. The data didn't exist or was out of date. The studies were scarce. The market research firms didn't serve this industry, or worse, the techniques didn't seem to have any clear practical application in our world. However, back in 2012 or 2013, I don't quite remember, a book fell into my hands and radically changed the way I saw the world. The book was Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. The book makes accessible, well, more or less accessible, because it's not an easy read. Don't expect a light little novel. As I was saying, it makes accessible to the general audience the concept developed by Mr. Kahneman himself and his collaborators over decades of research in the field of psychology of human behavior. This work earned him the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. And here I have to pause for a moment. Mr. Kahneman was not an economist, and yet he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. In fact, he is credited, among others, of course, with having founded a whole new field of academic knowledge known as behavioral economics. Kahneman received the Nobel Prize, in the words of the jury, for having integrated insights from psychological research into economic science, especially concerning human judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. But what's so special about that? Well, that behavioral economics calls into question classical economic theory, the one that holds that we, consumers, make rational decisions, and that these rational decisions are based on the perception of value to meet our needs and preferences, seeking to maximize according to our available resources. The proponents of behavioral economics, by contrast, question whether individuals make rational decisions in any consistent way. That is to say that individuals, especially in situations of risk or uncertainty, tend to make decisions that depart from what we would consider the rational response. And it isn't that these researchers were merely formulating hypotheses. Their publications were backed by solid statistical studies. Behavioral economics has developed spectacularly in both the academic and the business world. Hundreds of new university chairs around the globe, countless books and papers published, and an impressive influence on public policy and corporate practice. And I, for my part, have kept Kahneman, Thaler, and even Dan Ariely on a pedestal. And for years I immersed myself in genuine intellectual delight reading many of their texts. One of the keys to behavioral economics is that the research techniques developed in the academic world of psychology allow us, in theory, to empirically test or refute the hypotheses underpinning the predominant economic theories. The social sciences, like economics, have always suffered from the lack of intellectual respect from the scientists of the hard sciences. The physics, mathematics, chemistry, and so on. In that sense, the whole development of statistical techniques in psychological and sociological research was finally beginning to give economists the solid verifiability of the phenomena that they perceived and theorized about. These techniques, by their reach, displaced traditional econometrics, the mathematical foundation that was traditionally being used in economics. And thanks to that, among other things, economists could finally aspire to be considered science with a capital S. Well, thing has got complicated. Only recently have I learned that the moment when all began and the moment when it all started to crumble are ironically connected. 2011 was an important year in the history of psychology and of course of social psychology in particular. A highly respected scientific journal published an article making the incredible paranormal claim that human beings can foresee random events in the future when these are presented to them without their awareness, what they call reverse causality. Daryl Bem's 2011 papers called Feeling the Future in the prestigious Journal of Personality and Social Psychology has had a profound effect on social psychology. But instead of revealing a supernatural phenomenon, the paper ended up exposing the fundamental flaws in the way social psychologists were conducting and reporting their empirical studies. The same year, it also came to light that a social psychologist had falsified the results of dozens of publications. The former Dutch professor of social psychology at Tilburg University, Diederik Alexander Stapel, was suspended from his post at the university in 2011 for fabricating and manipulating data for his research publications. To date, 58 of these publications have been retracted, and he is regarded by some as the biggest con artist in academic science to date. And finally, as the culmination of all these coincidences, my admired Daniel Kahneman published in October 2011 as well the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which would have such a profound effect on me, and which he compiled not only his own research papers, but also many other findings from social psychology based on earlier studies. Although fraud and the continuous corrections of errors are part of science's own self-cleaning process, to say it like that, what brought on a wave of discredit, one that keeps on growing to this date, was Bem's research. Until 2011, psychologists, for the most part, believed that the research results published in their journals were entirely trustworthy. This really changed when Ben managed to provide apparently credible scientific evidence for paranormal phenomena, which of course, obviously, nobody was willing to believe. It became clear that even papers with statistically significant results could not be trusted. So great was the impact that Kahneman himself began to review the studies he had relied on to write his own book, less than a year after its publication. In 2012, Kahneman wrote an initial letter to the lead researchers of some studies on what they call implicit priming, expressing his doubts about the results. The fact that the respected Nobel laureate was willing to review and correct his own claims based on studies fully accepted until then attracted a great deal of attention, of course. And we haven't stopped since. The academic world is now immersed in what is known as the replication crisis, which means that if another similar study cannot replicate the results of the original one, everything is thrown into question. But since the studies that came out negative, well, they usually don't get published, sometimes we never are going to find out. But let's recap. Science advances on the basis of publications. You know, the famous papers. But only those that find something noteworthy get published, while those that find nothing get thrown out of the window. But even when they do get published, the researchers behind the original studies had until that moment found something to hold on to. If the later replication study had not been carried out under exactly the same conditions as the original research, the researcher would claim that it was therefore invalid and could invoke what they call the hidden moderator hypothesis. That is to say that social psychologists have convinced themselves that many of the phenomena they study are sensitive to the tiniest changes in experimental protocols, and that false negatives are quite possible, which of course is a bit comical. They take refuge in false negatives and not false positives, precisely the opposite of what the scientific method says. So in just one blow, this last decade has taken down both pillars of the scientific method in these social sciences. If the results of the experiments are not replicable, and on the other hand, the experiments meant to refute them are not going to be accepted because of excuses, then we have destroyed both replicability and falsifiability, or as the other people call it, refutability. And in that case, we could no longer, under any circumstances, be talking about science. In short, it has become evident that many social psychology papers report results that provide no credible evidence for their theoretical claims. The consequences of this uncomfortable realization are of a scale that is hard to imagine. The gravity of the matter means that entire textbooks spanning decades of research will have to be rewritten. The bad news is that knowing all this has turned me into somewhat a cynical skeptic. The good news, I guess, is that it hasn't killed my curiosity. Actually, quite the opposite. It has stimulated. And I now live in a state of intellectual curiosity that has led me, among others, to new authors like David Deutsch, with The Beginning of Infinity, of Nassim Taleb in their books Anti-Fragile. Meanwhile, the academic world is currently undergoing an impressive development of new research methods, tools to guard against fraud, and search for solidity in the statistical significance of studies. Logically, this is not something that stays within academia. This academic world is the one that has trained over several decades the legion of professionals who devote themselves to market research, surveys, and data management. Forgive me the simplification, but we have been trained, me included, in the belief that their science can uncover intrinsic truths about human societies and their individuals at the standard statistical significance level of 5% in a study. In other words, that if out of every 20 attempts, 19 give a possible result for my theoretical hypothesis, then there is eureka. I've discovered something. Well, no and a loud no. And it's often repeated these days. Correlation does not imply causation. The fact that the data says that two variables are statistically related does not mean that one causes the other, or vice versa. It's like the joke that the ice cream sales and shark attacks are correlated. Well, of course, both happened in the summer, but neither is the cause of the other in any possible way. Does this mean that we shouldn't read Kahneman or Thaler? Oh, not at all. To paraphrase Mr. Deutsch, most of their theories are the best explanations we currently have for the controversial phenomena in individuals and societies. Their hypotheses have a degree of a scientific intuition that still awaits confirmation by studies yet to come, of course. But the rest of us, well, we are not Kahneman or Thaler, and this is what leads me to my mocking tone, especially when I read press headlines about sector studies or data. I have to restrain myself from replying sarcastically on social media with phrases like "in your dreams," "no chance," "go on, try it and see what happens," "be my guest," and so on. One day I'll get around to categorizing and classifying all the types of misleading headlines and studies. But for now, let me leave you with an appetizer and some of the reasons why I think they are misleading. Why don't we start with the headlines about prices? For example, peppers in Spain sell for less or, in any case, more than in such and such country. Someone has cross-referenced data from two statistical sources, and they found story to tell about how clever they are in another country and how commercially stupid we are here. The story will almost certainly be false, misleading, or totally wrong. The scrutiny of the sources cited, if they are even cited, usually doesn't survive even 5 minutes of review. A typical example of error is that these types of peppers grown in one country and another aren't the same, so they can be compared. To use the agricultural typical expression, you don't compare apple to oranges. Another common error is that in one data set, the prices are at the farm level gate, and in another are at the wholesale level. Another is that the growing harvest period in one country or in the other is different. So they are facing a different price market. And that is the final reason why the price, of course, is going to be different. Let's jump into headlines I call, "I want a beautiful world." For example, a new study suggests that 4 out of 5 Canadians are willing to pay extra for fresh, locally produced food. This is a real headline from October 2020. This category could just as easily be called the survey news category. There are great pollsters who know what they're doing, but I can tell you that as far as I know, they don't work for our sector. Almost all surveys are downright misleading, especially when we ask consumers about well-meaning topics. Going back to the previous headline, if they stop you on your way out of the store, and somebody asks you, would you like to consume more local produce even if it's more expensive? What are you going to say? No? We usually say whatever makes us look good in that precise moment, as long as it has no consequences, of course. Another category of these misleading headlines would be health. An example would be like regular apple consumption is excellent for maintaining cholesterol levels. This is a recent headline in the media. The example probably isn't a good one. I shouldn't chosen an example from our sector, since those who tend to overdo it with misleading advertising about healthy attributes are typically the members of the industry of the processed foods. But anyway, still, it strikes me that also in fresh produce we follow this path of deceit and disappointment. Fresh products are infinitely healthier than processed ones, of course, but there is no scientific evidence of any kind that allows you to make the previous statement. And anyone who comes to tell me that there is a paper from such and such university on the subject should go back and listen to this episode from the beginning once again. So let's jump into headlines about consumption trends. For example, this season the demand for nectarines in the UK has increased by 30%. Another real headline, though somewhat old, from a few years ago, if I remember well. There is something I repeat constantly, and is that fresh produce is a supply-driven sector. You can't analyze a sector's sales data and say that this year consumers have taken a fancy to eating more nectarines. No. They ate more nectarines because there was a larger crop available and it was possible to run promotions and float in the market and the shelves at attractive prices. And it's almost always like that. As another famous author, Chris Anderson, would put it, many of our assumptions about popular taste are actually artifacts of poor supply and demand matching, a market response to inefficient distribution. In other words, consumers go to the store and take whatever is available there at any given moment, which means they will buy from among whatever others, of course, the professional buyers, have decided to put there in the assortment. Of course, up to the limit to the physical space in the store. Or in the case of fresh produce, also from whatever it's being harvested at that moment. As a general rule in fresh produce, consumption trends that aren't multi-year are not news. They are statistical noise, my friends. But don't despair. Data science isn't dead, despite what it might seem after everything I've told you in this episode. Even if decades have been lost and the overwhelming majority of what we come across professionally is smoke and mirrors, we are at the inflection point of an entire field of knowledge. The promise of finding value in data is so great that there are vast resources being poured into the development of this new discipline. And in another episode, I think I will share my opinion on how to implement knowledge development projects around data. But for today, I think I'll leave it here. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I invite you to subscribe to Fresconomics on your favorite platform. You can find me on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and even on YouTube. And remember to share it with others. Help me connect with the community of professionals in the fresh produce industry. Although it may take a while, I promise to respond to any questions, contributions, or suggestions you may send to web@daviddelpino.com. And of course, you can also visit my blog at daviddelpino.com, where you'll find out how to get a copy of the book Fresconomics, along with articles and additional content. Until next time, take care and try to enjoy this crazy business.